In some ways, reading prophecies from 2,500 years ago is a little bit like watching the news from 2,500 years ago. Or to put the equivalent, if someone in 4,500 AD was sitting down to watch the news that we watch today, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to them because the names of places would have changed. Certain countries that exist now won't exist in 2,500 years. So they'd find they'd had to do a little bit of work in order to understand what's being talked about. The same is true for us as we refer to all these ancient place names that maybe aren't that familiar now. Um, let's just talk briefly about some of the other countries, and then we'll talk about a prophecy that's made of Jesus in chapter 11. So briefly, a couple of other countries. God predicts the destruction of the Assyrians, and that happens in chapter 10, verse 24. The Assyrians were a people who'd conquered part of Israel and taken 10 of the tribes off into exile, and he's saying, I'm going to destroy them. And then in chapter 13, he prophesies the destruction of this people, the Babylonians, and Babylon. Babylon was the country that ultimately conquered the rest of Israel, a place called Judah, and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took everybody off into exile. And so Babylon is the place where Daniel, for example, is in exile, and there's other things that happen in Babylon as well. And God ultimately is saying, I'm going to destroy the Babylonians. And what he says here is the way he's going to do that is through the Medes. So you see in verse 17 of chapter 13, I will stir up against them the Medes. The Medes were the Persians, and historically that's what happened. So you first of all had the Assyrians, who were a big superpower. They kind of faded away, and the Babylonians became the superpower. And then ultimately the Babylonians were destroyed and defeated by the Persians, and that's just how it was. And over the period of this time, Israel has a very messy relationship with God, in which they end up going into exile and getting beaten up by all sorts of people. Ultimately, however, God promises that he will bring salvation. They have to go through what they're about to go through because they've just been so unfaithful to God's promises and the relationship they had. He has to let go of his protection of them. But then he promises salvation. And this is the shoot that's going to come up from the stump of Jesse. In other words, there's going to be a bloke, a person who is descended from Jesse, i.e. David, because Jesse was David's dad. Someone who's going to be descended from David is going to be a saviour. And they wouldn't have understood it to refer to Jesus as we do today. But now, in the light of Jesus arriving, we can see that there's a picture of him painted here in Isaiah's words. First of all, it talks about the Spirit of the Lord being on him. That's how Jesus begins his ministry in Luke chapter 4. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. Although he's referencing Isaiah 61 there. But you've got, first of all, this notion of the Spirit of the Lord is on him, and it brings wisdom and understanding. So the first thing Jesus brings is revelation. The second thing Jesus brings, if you look at the stuff about righteousness and judging the needy, is he brings justice. Jesus brings justice into the world. And the third thing he brings, you see the lion and the calf lie down together, is he brings peace. The Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, comes into our world and he brings us revelation, he brings us justice, and he brings us peace. If you need any of those things today, you can come to him and you will find him more than willing to give them.